48 BCE, Caesar's fire supposedly erased civilization's memory. It barely singed it. You're probably picturing one grand building stuffed with every scroll in the ancient world. The sum of human knowledge gone in a single night. That image is almost entirely wrong. Here's what actually happened. The library was founded around 285 BCE by Ptolemy II. He was a Macedonian king ruling Egypt after Alexander died. The library sat inside a bigger research institution called the Mauseon, literally, the Shrine of the Muses. Think government-funded think tank, not grand book warehouse. The Ptolemies grabbed scrolls aggressively. Every ship docking at Alexandria had to surrender its books for copying. They bought entire private libraries, including part of Aristotle's personal collection. Ancient sources claim the collection hit 700,000 scrolls. Modern scholars, less impressed by ancient bragging, put it at 40,000 to 100,000 at its peak. That 40,000 figure sounds staggering, but most scrolls weren't unique works. They were duplicates, multiple copies of Homer, of Euripides, of standard reference texts already held in libraries across the Mediterranean. The library was a working collection for resident scholars, not an archive of one-of-a-kind manuscripts. And here's the fact that shatters the entire myth. Alexandria wasn't the only library in the ancient world. Pergamum had a rival collection of roughly 200,000 scrolls. Antioch had one, Ephesus had one. Constantinople would eventually build one. Rome had dozens of private libraries. Knowledge was never centralized in a single building. What was actually inside? Mostly Greek literature, the canonical plays, poems, and philosophical texts already widely copied across the Mediterranean, plus mathematical and astronomical works by Euclid and Aristarchus, whose ideas were already being taught and transmitted through their students to other centers of learning. There were medical texts, geographical surveys, and commentaries on earlier works. Some were genuinely valuable, some were genuinely unique. But the idea that the library held secret knowledge that would have changed the course of civilization, a scroll with the blueprint for steam engines or antibiotics, that's a fantasy projected backward by people who wanted history to have a clean villain. Now the real history of the library's destruction. It wasn't one fire. It was a slow, centuries-long decline. By the time Caesar arrived in 48 BCE, the library had already lost much of its funding. The later Ptolemies weren't the scholars their predecessors were. Budgets shrank. Scholars drifted away to better postings. In 48 BCE, during Caesar's military campaign in Alexandria, a fire broke out in the harbor district. Ancient sources say it burned a warehouse where some library scrolls were stored. But the main library, the Bruchium, appears to have survived untouched. Cleopatra, who was ruling at the time, didn't treat this as a civilization-ending catastrophe, because it wasn't one. Here's what the sources actually tell us. The fire burned grain stores, some docks, and possibly an annex collection of around 40,000 scrolls stored near the harbor. The main collection, located hundreds of meters inland, was untouched. Mark Antony later gave Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the Pergamum library as a gift, replacing any losses and then some. The real destruction came centuries later. In 272 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought a revolt in Alexandria. The urban warfare destroyed the Bruchium district, the neighborhood where the main library stood. This is probably when the library was effectively destroyed as a functioning institution. Not by a dramatic fire set by a famous villain, by imperial military suppression. In 391 CE, the Emperor Theodosius ordered pagan temples destroyed. The Serapeum, a daughter library and temple, was demolished by Christians. Whatever scrolls remained there were lost. And by 642 CE, when Arab forces took Alexandria, there was no great library left to burn. The story that the Caliph Omar ordered the remaining scrolls burned to heat bathhouses for 6 months. It appears in sources written roughly 400 years after the events, by a Christian chronicler with every reason to frame the conquest as barbarism. Modern historians consider it almost certainly fabricated. There was likely nothing left to burn. So the popular narrative that a single fire set by Caesar or by Christians or by Muslims destroyed the sum of ancient knowledge in one night is wrong in almost every particular. It was a 1,000-year decline, and the knowledge was never centralized in one place to begin with. The myth, as we know, it was largely constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Edward Gibbon, writing about the decline of Rome, framed the library's loss as a civilizational catastrophe. Later writers, from Carl Sagan to internet memes, amplified it into a parable about knowledge being fragile and ignorance being the default state of humanity. It's a compelling story. It's also bad history. Here's what we genuinely lost. Some works of Greek literature that don't survive in other copies, perhaps additional plays by Sophocles and Aeschylus, since we know they wrote far more than the handful that come down to us. Some scientific commentaries and marginal notes from Alexandrian scholars. Some works of Hellenistic poetry and literary criticism that were never widely copied elsewhere. Those are real losses. A scholar of Greek drama would give a great deal to read the missing plays of Aeschylus, of which we know there were at least 70. We have only 7. But would those plays have changed the trajectory of science, technology, or governance? Almost certainly not. They would have enriched our understanding of literature. They wouldn't have given us electricity. Now what follows is speculation grounded in real events. Let's imagine the divergence. The Library of Alexandria never burns. Not in 48 BCE, not in 272, not in 391. Every scroll survives, every commentary is preserved. The Mausian functions continuously for another 1,000 years. What changes? The honest answer is almost nothing. And the reason is simple. The library was never the sole repository of ancient knowledge. Its contents were largely duplicates of works that existed in other libraries, in private collections, in the hands of scholars across the entire Greek-speaking world. Saving the copies in Alexandria doesn't save knowledge that wasn't lost. If the Alexandrian collection survived intact, the works already duplicated elsewhere, Homer, Euripides, Euclid, would simply exist in one more location. The transmission of Greek knowledge to the Islamic world, which actually happened through translation movements in 8th and 9th century Baghdad, would still happen. Those translations drew on surviving texts in Constantinople and Antioch, not Alexandria. The Renaissance rediscovery of Greek texts in the 15th century, the event that supposedly would have happened earlier if only the library had survived, was driven by the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Byzantine scholars fled west carrying Greek manuscripts. Those manuscripts had been copied and recopied in Constantinople for 1,000 years. Alexandria's survival wouldn't have accelerated this process by a single decade. Here's the harder truth. The bottleneck was never the existence of texts. It was the existence of institutions willing and able to study them. The Roman Empire didn't industrialize not because it lacked Archimedes' manuscripts, but because it lacked the economic incentives, the capital markets, and the intellectual culture to turn theory into practice. Those scrolls sitting safely in Alexandria wouldn't have changed that. What about the specific losses, the missing plays of Aeschylus, the lost works of Hellenistic science? In our speculation, those survive. A few hundred additional Greek plays enter the canon. Some commentaries by Aristarchus of Samothrace on Homeric scholarship survive and slightly redirect 19th century classical studies. A handful of medical texts by Herophilus give historians a clearer picture of ancient anatomy. But none of these change the macro story. No additional play of Sophocles gives you the steam engine. No commentary on Homer gives you the printing press. No anatomical text by Herophilus gives you germ theory. The relationship between stored knowledge and civilizational progress isn't simple, and the library's survival would prove that with painful clarity. The idea that losing the library set humanity back by centuries or by 1,000 years or by any specific amount. That's the myth we need to bury. You can't lose what was never centralized. And the ancient world never centralized its knowledge in one building. It was a network, and the network had redundancy built in. The library was one node, not the whole system. The real story of knowledge preservation is messier and more interesting than the myth. Greek texts survived because monks in Byzantium copied them, because Arab scholars in Baghdad translated them, because Jewish communities in Spain transmitted them, because Irish monks preserved Latin literature. The Library of Alexandria was one node in that network, an important one, but never a single point of failure. If the library had survived, it might have become a museum, a tourist attraction, a symbol. The scrolls would have been gradually copied, recatalogued, eventually digitized, and their contents would have merged with the broader body of ancient texts that we already have. The additional plays of Aeschylus would be taught in university courses. Scholars would write papers about them, and the world would look almost exactly as it does now. The myth of the library matters because it reveals something about how we want history to work. We want a single villain, a single catastrophe, a single moment when everything went wrong. It's comforting to believe that if only that one fire hadn't happened, we'd have flying cars and colonies on Mars. But history doesn't work through single points of failure. It works through systems, incentives, and slow structural forces. Knowledge isn't a vault that can be burned. It's a living practice carried by people, institutions, and incentives. The Library of Alexandria was extraordinary, but it wasn't the load-bearing wall of ancient civilization. When it burned, the structure held, not because the loss wasn't real, because the loss was distributed across 1,000 other libraries, 1,000 other scribes, 1,000 other cities. So would Rome have industrialized if Alexandria's scrolls had survived? No. Would we have reached the moon by 1492? No. The library was a magnificent institution, and its loss was a genuine cultural tragedy for classical scholars. But it wasn't a civilizational reset button. Humanity didn't lose 1,000 years in one fire. It never had those years to lose. The Library of Alexandria survives in our imagination as the thing we blame for not being further along. But the truth is harder and more honest. The barriers to progress were never stored in a scroll. They were built into the structure of the world itself. If this changed how you think about the Library of Alexandria, share it and tell me in the comments, what lost ancient work would you most want to read?